I'll give this to you. Great concert. I mean, really, really fantastic. Yeah, really loved it. The first thing I want to ask about is actually the Nunc Ensemble, because there wasn't that much information about that. Tell us about that. You're the director, and I know you told me about it, but tell everybody about it.
Well, Nunc is an organization, a nonprofit that I founded. I actually started it as a kind of informal series, doing a couple events a year. It was not incorporated yet, and it had a different name. It was called Transit Circle, which is a kind of a telescope. And then I figured nobody knew what that was, so I looked for something else. Everybody knows what Nunc is right now.
Well, that's true. Okay.
Well, and Nunc is a Latin word for now, and I kind of like that because it's both in an ancient language, but it's also meaning now. So it past and present all together in one word and one syllable. And so it's not a set group of instrumentalists, or it's sort of it changes so you can accommodate all sorts of different things? Yeah, that was kind of the idea. I decided I didn't really want to just have an ensemble per se of a set bunch of people, but just to have the flexibility to bring all sorts of people for, a variety of projects and people I thought would like to do certain concerts and work together. But of course there are people that I tend to work with a lot. So like Blair and I have done a lot together, and people return. You sort of have a core, but you can expand, which is great for contemporary music that has all sorts of different combinations. But you don't do entirely contemporary either. No. In the spirit, you do both mixed programs like this. I mean, well, this was just right, up my alley in terms of the mission of... You can't hear us? Could we have some more, Mike? Sorry, I'll try to talk into it. No, they'll take care of it back. There we are. That's better. Yeah. So this program was great in terms of the mission of Nunc, bridging old and new. It was really just the sort of thing that I really wanted to do with this organization. Well, that's great. And David, first of all, thanks for coming, and thanks for, we actually heard a premiere tonight of Extended Puppy, which I'm told is a yoga pose, which I think you're going to show us right now. Is that? I
brought the mat. No, Blair's actually going to show us. Oh, okay. Well, you read in the program the history of the piano etudes and preludes as it existed. Sebastian got in touch with me last September, I think, saying, Blair knows these two pieces of yours, Absifunk and Lutli and Toy Together. He's going to play them, and I thought it would be nice if you wrote another etude just to go along with these two that would pair with them, actually, even though there were three of them. And I said, I don't write etudes anymore because I wrote 100 and I finished them all like 3 years ago. After 100, like, what do you mind? One more. It's like so I said, but I'm writing preludes now. They're different from etudes because, etudes start with E-T and preludes start with P-R-E-L. And I said, I'd be glad to tailor one to go with those two. But the preludes are different from the etudes in a few regards. All the stuff is in the program and so forth. But each book of 10 preludes, 1 to 10, 11 to 20, and so forth, is thematically titled. So the first book is all palindromes. All the titles are palindromes. In the second book, all 10 preludes have the same title, which is a nightmare for the performing rights organizations, trying to figure... All 10 preludes are called Mind the Gap, so if someone plays a piece called Mind the Gap, they have to look and figure out which one it is, 11 through 20. The third book is onomatopoeia, words like purr and cuckoo and sizzle and so forth. And I was just starting book 4, and I think my wife suggested I name them all after yoga poses, because we've been doing yoga for 2 years, I don't have to tell you why, we just have been. And I had already written one, and this is when Sebastian said, write another etude. I said, I'll write a prelude, and it'll be named after a yoga pose. And Sebastian said, no, really. So
that's great. I have to ask you, so for palindromes, do you have a movement, sex at noon taxes?
No, I do not.
Well, you can always add one. Okay.
There is one called Pull a Wall Up.
Good to know.
Anyway, so... I was thinking of something that would complement the two etudes that I knew he was already going to be playing. They're both fiercely rhythmic, a lot of notes, a lot of streams of notes, and so forth. And this one is meant to sort of bridge the gap between the two. It's rhythmic, but it doesn't have a pulse. The pulse keeps changing. It's a little faster and a little longer, a little shorter. And once I sort of got the shape of the piece in mind, I went to my whole book of yoga poses and found one that looked and sounded the most like what I was already writing. And that was Extended Puppy, which I haven't done yet. But your butt's really high in the air.
Sounds good. And so tell me a little bit about playing these pieces, too. And obviously the first piece with toy piano, that's sort of hard when you have this sort of irregular configuration.
Yeah. I mean, you're in an awkward position, and you're looking here, and your hand is over here. It feels completely surreal, certainly at first. But the new piece, Extended Puppy, there's no time signature. Like there is in Absefunk-and-Lutely, and every measure is a different number of beats. I mean, the first measure will be, say, in 9/8, and the next measure, you're figuring this out on your own, by the way. I figured this out on my own, but David was nice enough not to write in time signatures, but every measure is a different time signature. So some measures will be, say, 13/8, and the next measure will be 11/16, and the next measure will be 15/16, and it's very odd because the way notes are beamed, you're used to seeing notes beamed in symmetrical groupings of 3 or 4 or 8. In Extended Puppy, Davy's been incredibly mean and and written a piece where the beamings are different in both the treble and the bass clef. So they don't line up. One beam in the right hand will go for, say, 5/16 notes, and the beaming in the left hand will go for 3/16 notes and then 4/16 notes. So it really was playing tricks on me in a big way. So it was a challenge. Unlike
try the Extended Puppy. It might help you.
Yeah, I got to take up yoga. The only thing I know about yoga is how to spell it, and that it involves mats. That's all I know.
I see. So
it was a great
yourself.
challenge, and
right.
Yeah.
But great. But sounded great. And I just want to ask Dave a question too, as we move to talking about Ligeti, because the second movement of the Ligeti is actually there's this piano etude that he and as a matter of fact even other piano etudes sort of show up in that and so it seems like and in the piano concerto too. So Ligeti who wrote is it 18 etudes I think up to or so I thought there was 6 something like that and they're very wonderful pieces. I think some of them were played here maybe last year. But I wonder, when you're writing all these etudes, because they're shorter pieces, you're taking time out from bigger pieces, do they sometimes become sketches for pieces you're doing or ways to work things out?
There are ways to work things out. There are ways of dealing with notions I have compositionally without having to deal with putting them into a larger piece. And when I'm writing the larger pieces, they sometimes infect them. They go the way of developing things, or the way I might have done harmony on one piece becomes part of a bigger piece. Yes.
Right. So they do sort of
let you
sketch things out.
Yes.
That's great. So and then we have, of course, the two main pieces of this program. Both. I mean, some of the only instances that I know, maybe one other piece, and an unusual instrumentation, these two horn trios. Mike, tell me a few things. I'd love to know both the experience of playing, because I didn't know it's when we started talking about this program that they're often on recordings, they're paired together, but they're not played that often together just because of the sort of Herculean effort to do them. Is that accurate to say?
Yes, as was probably very evident in the Ligeti trio,
wasn't
especially.
To me.
He just extends the range beyond anything that had been done before. He also had this reconceptualizing the horn as a collection of 14 natural horns. You may or may not know that the valves did not become part of the French horn until the early 20th century. Before that, horns could only play in one key. So when you added the valves, you added tubing so you could play chromatically. And rather than using it in a conventional way, Ligeti reimagined it as a way to use lots of different natural harmonics, and he uses them to great effect, sounding kind of like a weird, like indigenous instrument that plays
Right.
melodies in the second movement, for example.
Exactly, and of course the Brahms was written for a natural horn too, so it
Yes.
relates in that sense.
Brahms himself was actually an amateur horn player and had a preference for the natural horn, which around his time, some of the early modern valved horns were appearing, and he preferred greatly the sound of the natural horn and specified that greatly. But yes, the Brahms, the Ligeti trio in the title is actually a homage of Brahms, so it's very much in mind and not a coincidence that both of these are built around the traditional natural horn sound.
Right, and I was ask all you about that actually, about and David too, if you want to, about the connection. What did I read? Something that Brahms, I mean, this was in Wikipedia, I assume it's accurate, but it wasn't, you never know, right? That he said, Ligeti said it was, the only thing that, the only relationship was a sort of smilingly conservative comportment, which he was looking at an ironic distance. I mean, did you, playing the two pieces, do you find connections in there? Does it seem ironic, his connection? Any of you or all of you? Yeah.
I think so, definitely. If you think of the third movement where he instructs the horn player to lift his bell up, take his hand out, and just sort of blare over the instruments while they're playing this disjunct march, I think that's very ironic. And also just having the horn do all of these very, going to the extremes and, making it sort of a gamble. I don't know. What do you think?
And motivic connections or anything else? Or any of you?
The Ligeti has a motto, a three-note motto that is sort of a modern version of horn fifths.
Exactly, but of course it's the Beethoven Les Adieux closer.
Yeah. And the horn fifths are a big part of one of the movements. There's a whole.
Many of the movements.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's just a part of the whole thing of the horn. So that's what you're going to get when you're running for horn.
Mm-hmm. Right. So again, alluding to the natural horn in a sense, because those are the intervals you'd end up getting that way. Great, and Miranda, the Ferneyhough, tell us about that. Quite, a lot of notes there.
A lot of notes. Well, Brian Ferneyhough is known, or maybe notorious, for writing extremely complex music, such as what you heard him very complicatedly notated, and there's a certain element of kind of impossibility in sort of built into his music, that there's stuff that really there is no actual way to really execute it, and you just have to. He wants just the effort of trying to do it is really what's being conveyed more than actually playing what's there. And also it's an interesting kind of interaction between the performer and him, because you have to invent some way of, you have to find your own solutions in some ways to execute it, so everybody will come up with something a little bit personal and different. And in terms of his notation, of course, it gets into very conceptual realms of, these polyrhythms, very, very complicated. And you can't really think these things as they're going on in real time. I mean, you can sit down at your desk and do the math and everything, but in the end, it just comes down to finding a gestural pacing that is musical, like in any music, and I think, as I put in the note, he tends to write in these very slow meters, actually. So there are these, if you check with the metronome, there are these very slow markers where, to me, it helps just have a sense of how much time is going by, and within that, there's all this tremendous complexity. But you just sort of, you have to invent within that some way of phrasing. So it's an interesting mix of all this very kind of cerebral stuff, but also just
it's very visceral in the end too.
Yeah, and very physical, obviously, and
And is it the first time I knew you were? Have you played this before, or just?
No, that was my first performance of it.
Yeah,
so.
Fantastic.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks. Yeah, so it's great. Great. Well, does anybody have any questions for any of them, or?
I wanted to ask Miranda how it felt playing three pieces. When you're doing
with each piece. Oh, certainly. Well, I mean, it was amazing. A range of, going from Ferneyhough to Brahms is pretty,
I know that was
pretty extreme. Well, in every way, I mean, both. I mean, emotionally, it's a completely different thing, and the Brahms is something you just have to really sink into, and you get very. Yeah, it's a very kind of direct but very deep kind of emotion, and the Ferneyhough is more about the spirit of the moment and everything, and then also in terms of playing style, it's so different, and obviously I grew up playing all these more of the things like Brahms and Beethoven and Schumann and these sorts of things, and there's a bit of a different physical approach to making the sound, and so today was rather extreme thing to have to go, because the Ferneyhough you have to kind of gear yourself up, and there's a certain amount of tension you have to have in your body just to be jumping around and doing all this stuff.
Right. One of the things I like about the Ferneyhough is the extended techniques are so extreme at places, it starts to make the instrument sound different, like it becomes this different thing. Right?
Yeah.
So, somebody else?
I'm interested specifically in the responsibility that develops on the horn and the violin, when there are only three instruments and only two of them can actually bend pitches slightly. The harmonic series of the horn is something that's present anytime the violin plays in an orchestra, but now it's up to you to make both acoustic and harmonic sense of it. Do you do that while you play, if you ever actually talk about it?
Yeah, maybe Mike should.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of it, how we go in and out of those roles is very much prescribed in the score, in the Ligeti, very much. And he instructs very precisely which part of which overtone series you're supposed to be doing at any given moment. And so, but I take that information, and my approach has to change kind of instantly, very much in the manner that Miranda described just now, is, when you can have a certain kind of physicality when you're moving air between all of these tubes here, but when you're reduced to just using one, you have to, you can't really be too aggressive, or else you'll miss the partials that you're going for. Does that make sense? They are, and what Brahms does, because of his, very often he will put notes, because the way that the natural horn would play chromatically was the hand would be closed sometimes in the bell, and it would create sometimes a brassy stop sound, and oftentimes he will put these notes in sort of harmonically aggressive places, or he'll put it within a note of a chord that is meant to sort of highlight, part of a larger harmonic motion arc. So, and while I did not play, obviously I didn't play the Brahms on a natural horn. Actually, it'd probably be a lot easier, come to think of it. But I try to bear that in mind when I see these moments, when I know that, oh, Brahms, he knows that this note is going to be stopped, and he wants a little more of this kind of edgy sound. So I will definitely take that into account in my interpretation.
Behind?
Thank you.
You made a comment that I may have missed it. Homage to Brahms, but was there any quotation in anywhere in Ligeti?
Not particularly. We said, as David was pointing out, no, there's a sense of the past, because this was a sort of turning point for Ligeti, where he's sort of looking at music in the past in a slightly different way. And so, in that sense, the instrumentation, which is very unique, it obviously already connects on a point of sonority just by being the same instrumentation, but thematically there's not a big connection, and there's actually a bigger connection to this Beethoven Sonata, Opus 81, that uses the same, as he was saying, horned fifths, which was just a sort of type of voice leading that you had in horn parts in orchestra music, for example.
Yeah, so there are no literal literal quotes from Brahms, but he does pay homage to Brahms in the four movement structure.
Exactly,
Obviously,
sort of the
both
structure
pieces
a
are
little
four
bit.
movements. Yeah. But I mean, the opening is as we said, a direct, not a direct quote, but it's a warped or a twisted representation of a piano sonata that Beethoven wrote, the Les Adieux, Opus 81A, which is in E flat major, the natural horn, the key that the natural horn could play in. And it's boom, 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 and we pass that back and forth throughout the first movement. So, in a sense, it's as much a Beethoven homage, although unstated and unwritten. But yeah.
If I can add to that, that quotation also happens right before the end of the second movement. It's in the piano, just a little more harmonized. But if you notice, in the third and the slow movement of the Brahms, there are a lot of moments where the horn and violin actually work like two horns, and they play these horn fifths together. So that's a style that is very prominent and has to do, in the case of the third movement, dedicated to the memory of his mother who had recently passed away. And so it's as much, so there's that reference and how it gets kind of morphed in the Ligeti, but it's very much, as we were saying before, as sort of a tip of the hat to how natural horns used to be used, and Ligeti is saying, okay, now look what I'm going to do to it, and just kind of blows it up. So
Maybe one last question, if anybody. Anybody? No. So we'll leave it at that. Thanks very much for coming. Thank you all for a fantastic performance.